Yes, and I just want to acknowledge Lisa Topper's work in this as well.
Thank you. Councillor Crum.
We've all got vexed examples in our wards, undoubtedly. So understand and really welcome the Reserves Act versus the Local Government Act work, and really timely. So fantastic, thanks. Give me an example of how you'll be simplifying procedures before Christmas. Well, you've got under immediate action first. Actually, Christmas isn't first 3 months, but you've got under the first 3 months simplifying procedures. So, an example.
So, through the chair, one of the things we've looked at with the local boards in particular is to focus on what are the priorities we're trying to achieve and what's the best way of achieving that. Now, we previously always relied upon creating a document called a Community Outcomes Plan that we went through quite a lot of effort to create. There's a lot of back and forth with groups. It was quite laborious. It was great in that we could see what was going to be achieved through the investment of these community facilities, but it was tiresome, I think, for everyone involved. And alongside that, there were two or three other touch points with the community groups that we needed to square away before we could enter into a new or renewed lease. And we had to do a physical check of the building, we had to do a check of their operating health, we had to do a check of their incorporated status, for example. And typically they were a little bit ad hoc and consequently required a lot of effort. What we've done is to put all of those things together. We now meet with the group's representative once. We do it on their site at their convenience, and we gather everything we need in that instance. And we probably save at least 15 hours per exercise. That's of our time, but most importantly, it's of time on the community group side that's all voluntary. It's all invariably discretionary effort. So that's the sort of change that we've been providing.
And through the chair, just to clarify, Councillor Crum, the 3 months was the 3 months from September to now. So we've been instituting the things that Kevin's just described in order for us to achieve our targets by Christmas. So that's why you've seen the dramatic increase in productivity and change and what we've been able to deliver because of what we've instituted in the last 3 months.
Thank you. Councillor Casey.
Thanks for the report, Kevin. I'm just interested in whether your totals include the community leases on the Maunga and whether this framework is going to cover them as well, or they're being dealt with separately.
So through the chair, yeah, Maunga Authority leases are now dealt with separately. It's actually the same team that's providing the advice to the Maunga Authority, but of course, given the different structures there and decision-making responsibilities, that advice is not aligned to the community occupancy guideline, but is aligned to the guiding documents around the Maunga Authority and the vision for the Maunga. So, same team, slightly different approach, sat in parallel to this work.
Just a couple of questions about that. Does the local board have any part in that Maunga process?
No.
None.
No.
How many leases are there on the Maunga?
I believe there's in the region of 30.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, thanks, Madam Chair. This is great work because, man, this has been a pathway strewn with broken glass. Some of it was ours, some of it was Legacy Council, some of it was actually the bodies who were doing the leases, and some of it was the Crown. So, well done, and clearly I see your guiding hand here quite a bit. So, this is good work that needs to be done, and the rapid uplift in productivity is massive. My question follows on from what briefly Councillor Penrose talked about, was in the powered communities approach. How is this going to tie in with that? Because the two really go hand in hand to give the local boards the ability to deliver what these community leases often work with trying to deliver as well. So they're two parallel pieces of work that should have the similar outcome.
Yep.
So through the chair, I mean, I think this is a good illustration of our approach to realising empowered communities. So, you know, I suppose we talk empowered communities in terms of the outcome, but we very much talk enabling council in terms of our behaviours. So actually through the whole redesign of our way of working here, we've had that enabling council as our mantra. You know, how do we get out of the way, essentially, remove the barriers that our groups and our local boards in particular were saying were being experienced. Let's remove those barriers. Let's put the focus on what's quality of advice from an officer point of view, predicated on what's best for groups to get on and do the thing that they're passionate about and serves their community. So I think philosophically absolutely consistent.
Yeah, and I just add we want to make absolutely sure that we have the legal framework and funding tools available to achieve empowered communities. So that's sort of the way the guiding light of this actual work stream on looking at permitted uses.
Great, can't wait to see it being delivered right across the board.
You, Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's great that we're getting this together because it is one of the common things I hear as a councillor. But my plea is that yes, it is a local board function to approve these leases. However, often the local councillor will be the one getting the phone call and you know nothing about it, and it may be that everything the way it's been done is absolutely perfect, it's the right thing to do, but the group is disgruntled or somebody. And I just make a plea that when you're doing communications of anything, that the local councillors get a heads up, because some local boards will share information with you and some won't, and it just really helps the whole process if all elected members are on the same page, and often it might be the local councillor that has the biggest relationship with that group.
Yep.
And so they just come to you and they don't even understand the local boards involved. So if that could be even just copying in on an email, sometimes you can just go and help smooth the way if you get a good briefing. We are elected locally and we've often got very long relationships with these people and can help sometimes. So that's just the plea. Even if we just copied in, it gives us a heads up and we might be able to assist. Thank you.
Thank you. Good points. Councillor Filipina.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question. I'm also assuming that with the further phases and the phasing in is relation to ECEs as well? Okay, that's all right. It's just it hasn't been mentioned all this time, but there are ECEs and there's quite a few in my particular ward that are still getting requests to be located on our parks and reserves. So, but it's also the renewal, because there were a few that obviously wanted to get renewal, but the overload was just too much for staff. But I just hoping that that's also in the priority list.
So just a quick response to that. So the question around that appropriate activity on reserves or parks is very much around early learning centres as an example of, is that an appropriate use for our open space? Where do you start to draw the lines about what open space is for and what it's not for? Yeah. So that in the bigger picture, that's very much part of what's appropriate activity. In terms of the specifics, the specific cases that Kevin's team will be working through.
Because along the same lines is what Councillor Fletcher was talking about around sustainability, and for them at least, for a lease and long-term lease, around their longevity as an ECE. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Darby.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Kevin and others for the work. Kevin, you responded to Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Fletcher raised the importance of a reasonable term of tenure, and I think that's entirely valid. What I am aware of is very long terms of tenure. I've talked to you about this, but I really need to canvass it here because I'm aware of some boards, a board possibly taking the staff recommendations of 10 plus 10s and adding another 10, which potentially locks that facility or council asset up for 30 years. 30 years from now is 2045. 30 years back is 1985. That's an extremely long period to lock something up for. It's not just shutting out potentially other groups, and if you look at the dynamic of Auckland,
I think it's time, isn't it?
it's changing very, very quickly. And if you look at the sports area, we are going to be looking for more facilities for our Asian Aucklanders, and they're not probably footy fields, it's different, in the next 30 years. So I guess my question, Chair, is what are the parameters that the boards might have? And I'm a great fan of empowered communities and empowering the boards through greater delegations, but your team are making recommendations of 10 plus 10s, and almost arbitrarily boards are adding another 10 and shutting out possibly future users, a whole future generation. So I think this is something that we might have to discuss when you report back. Maybe others are keen to as well, but do you have some concern about that extra 10 that's being put into terms of leases?
So through the chair, generally the current terms contemplated through the community occupancy guidelines are, my view is they'd be pretty good. Where we've got new groups, perhaps those without a track record, probably in the establishment phase, we generally recommend 1+1 while they're in that early stage. Where we've got groups that are well established, they own their own building and typically have done for many years, the sort of maximum term is 10+10, and in between you've got components of 5 years. That works pretty well. As these are guidelines, and I have to say that local boards have made some hundreds of decisions since they were first enacted, and the vast majority of those decisions have been in accordance with those guidelines. So I think that's testament to the fact they're workable. There's been a few exceptions. They are just a few. Some local boards have gone for a shorter term, maybe 3+3 when we've recommended 5+5. And there's been a couple of cases that I'm aware of where boards have gone for very long term, 30 years. I think in every case we've strongly advised against that for the reasons that the councillor describes. I think it's an area to look at when we review. I'm confident with the advice that we provide. I suppose local boards are equally confident with the decision that they've made. It's something to consider at review time, but generally they've been exceptional.
Okay, Chair, I just think that that's something we might have to look at, because effectively you're disposing of that property for a unique group to use for a long period. 30 years is quite long. Now, in some cases that might be quite appropriate, where there's a large capital investment by a club over decades. But my view is that we probably need to be treading into this with eyes wide open as a governing body, and understand the implications of very long leases. The other thing I'd like to get picked up is the requirement for all lessees to at least consider and possibly implement waste plans and travel plans. A lot of these clubs are major generators of traffic on Saturdays, and they might play as a team, but very few of them travel as a team. And I think there's huge potential in that particular space. So I think I'd like to understand a bit more about these long leases in particular, and also the acknowledgement of council sponsoring those facilities and those entities, and having council be acknowledged on letterheads, the buildings themselves, because a lot of our community don't know that these facilities are actually sponsored through their rates. They just don't get it at all.
Thank you. I mean, good points. I think Councillor Fletcher made several of those. It has to be very site-specific, because, as Kevin so rightly said, I mean, some people have got considerable investment and long-term, and doesn't actually cost this council very much at all. I can think of one or two. But, you know, in other cases, they're very needy, so I think we have to reflect that. But maybe that can come back in the report, maybe in
Certainly.
March.
I'm very happy to follow
with
up on
some
those
examples,
specifics.
because, you know, we are a very wide area, and it would be very difficult to make one rule for the whole area. Councillor Wood.
Oh, thank you. Just in relation to, well, this issue in relation to Reserves Act vis-a-vis the Local Government Act, is that for existing reserves, or is that future use of land that is owned by council, that could, is it as parkland?
Well, a lot of our park, and particularly the regional parks, is held under the LGA anyway. When we get new parks that come as a result of resource consents and so on, vestings, they typically, or we endeavour to have those come across as LGA rather than be specified as going under the Reserves Act. But by and large, what we're talking about today is the existing parks and reserves that we have. And whether in any of those examples we would get a bit more operating flexibility for our communities if it was appropriate to hold them under the LGA under a framework of our choosing.
Well, I think that's an area that local boards should actually look at, because they're the people on the ground and they know what their requirements are. And a lot of communities presume that parks and open space are reserved. So, you know, and sometimes there's been an anomaly